My internet friends, welcome to this new webinar that we at the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean have prepared for you. On this occasion, in celebration of International Education Day, we shall be speaking about the right to higher education. Let us begin by putting on the table the following reflection. Is higher education a right, an absolute right, or just a moral obligation of states? We will try to respond to this question over the next few minutes. Please keep with us.
Let us begin by defining the concept of right. First of all, the term right is polysemic. For that reason, and for the purpose of this webinar, we have opted to use Ramsay Clark's definition of right. According to him, a right is not what someone giveth you. It is what no one can take from you. I would like to ask you to keep that at the back of your heads because we will come back to this at the end of this presentation. The legal provisions that comprise international law can be twofold, those which are classified as hard law and those as soft law. What's the difference between these two? The difference is that the first are legally binding. In other words, they have legal effectiveness, while the second are not legally binding. To help you to understand, let us consider the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, de facto, a declaration and consequently its precepts are not legally binding nor obligatory. So you will then wonder, how is it possible that the precepts of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are not legally binding if they are the foundation of any constitutional, social, and democratic state? This is indeed the case, and that is why they appear in two treaties, specifically the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which would be signed years later. As you can see from this slide, there are many other legal instruments in international law. However, for the purposes of this presentation, we shall focus on only the first two. Why is this? Well, simply because these are the two treaties which capture some of the most important provisions regarding the right to education, holistically speaking, and therefore include higher education. Also, we focus on only these two because of time. This next slide shows you a number of legal instruments which come under soft law. Remember that these have moral value, having been agreed and subscribed by states but are not legally binding. Let me repeat it. These have moral value, having been agreed and subscribed by states but are not legally binding. Here you see that two of the most recent non-binding instruments are the Declaration of Córdoba, a product of CRES 2018, and the UNESCO Global Convention for the Recognition of Qualifications in Higher Education. In this next slide, you can see the chronological list of the various legal instruments as of 1948, which has been incorporated into the body of international law and which somehow impact, expressly or tacitly, on the right to education. Please note that the titles in red indicate legally binding instruments, and the ones in blue are not legally binding. They all constitute the material substratum of the right to education and are absolutely important for the right to higher education. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in its Article 26, states literally that we all have the right to education, and higher education shall be accessible to all on the basis of merit. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, in its Article 13, states literally that higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. Finally, the Charter of the Organization of American States, in its Article 49, provides for the effective exercise of the right to education through compulsory elementary education for all, that is free of charge when provided by the state, and the station of middle level and higher education. This next slide shows us the instruments that were developed in the last 20 years. Please note that, compared to the previous slide, this one shows a lot more blue, which says that more non-binding than binding instruments has been produced in recent years, and these are the ones which have legal effects and are binding. Why then are the efforts of the international community to create non-binding legislation or soft laws so important? Contrary to common belief, the non-binding law carries weight at the international level, since this quasi-legislation, while not being legally binding, helps countries to implement other laws that are binding. Similarly, these soft or non-binding laws are usually observed by countries who are convinced that they should be respected as if they were binding. In other words, they attribute a moral value to it, whereby, without being a right in the stricto sensu of the word, it could be one in the future. Production of soft law is the most common way in which many international public law instruments, whether declaration, action frameworks, resolutions, plans, etc., become international treaties with legal effect. As we said earlier, the binding instruments found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came from two international covenants. Following the signing of the two covenants, human rights were split into two categories: the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and Civil and Political Rights. The 1966 political and civil rights are positivized at the constitutional level and become fundamental rights, a basic substratum for any social and democratic rule of law. When we speak of positivization, we refer to the precepts or provisions incorporated into the country's legislation by the legislator, which then become obligatory and binding. Essentially, this civil and political right, that is, the right to life, physical integrity, freedom, etc., don't require material obligations on the part of states, only is restraint and non-interference in the affairs of private citizens. They are called first-generation rights. The application of what are known as second-generation rights, that is, economic, social, and cultural rights, the category that includes the right to education, requires the effective intervention of the part of the public authorities by way of aid and public services. According to international law, first-generation rights must be immediately respected. This is also the case for some second-generation rights, that is, economic, social, and cultural rights. For example, the right to compulsory and free primary education. Nevertheless, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights allows for some of the rights it upholds to be respected for a period of time, and this is based on the principle of progressive implementation. However, it is widely accepted that all human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. This is evidenced internationally in the adoption of treaties that combine civil and political rights with economic and social rights, for example, the Convention on the Right of the Child. In the case of those states which have signed legally binding treaties, the legal precepts should be incorporated into national legislation to be part of its internal legal system. However, not all states have compiled, developed, nor instrumentalized these rights in their respective national legal frameworks, and consequently, their justiciability, that is, it is not always possible to access the legal bodies of states to claim them. Kindly note that this doesn't mean that by signing and ratifying the covenant, the signatory state can ignore its obligations but not having incorporated them expressly in its national legislation. In the first place, as Roman said, pacta sunt servanda, and secondly, there is a watchdog committee for the implementation of the International Covenant on International Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which ensure and monitors the progress of each state in fulfilling their goals. Let us think for a moment on Article 26 of the Universal Declaration. Is it really possible to apply this condition successfully to a university system which has the capacity to receive only 1% of the world population? Those countries which have ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights cannot renege on their obligations, claiming not to have adequate means to make higher education accessible to all. The Watch Committee, which oversees the implementation of the pact by states, have declared that gradual implementation should not be misinterpreted as a removal of the obligation from the important content, since it would destroy the very objective and purpose of the covenant. Member states who have signed and ratified the pact under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties cannot invoke existing national legislation as an excuse for non-compliance of the obligations acquired by virtue of this convention. The best legal protection member states can give to the right to education is to restrain it with legislative powers. We see how 82% of national constitutions worldwide enshrine this right. For example, Argentina, Cuba, and Russia guarantee in their Magna Carta access to free primary, secondary, and higher education. Finland, which is referenced in education matters, includes in its constitution reference only to free basic education, while in fact it is free from preschool to doctoral level. In some cases, countries go beyond what the covenant requires. This is particularly true at the kindergarten level, which unfortunately doesn't have the prominence it should in international human rights law. The Constitution of the Russian Federation, for example, stipulates that all levels of education are free. Some member states consider that international law and national law constitute the legal order of a country. This means that when a treaty is ratified, it automatically becomes a part of national law. This is the case for Albania, Argentina, Sweden, and others. Other member states guarantee the right to education in their organic laws. However, the committee which oversees and monitors this legal instrument recommends preference that it be accorded constitutional status, since the supreme law normally is subject to less changes. It is important to note that the right to education and sustainable development goals are mutually reinforcing. For example, according to international law, states have the immediate obligation to provide free primary education, but can progressively provide the same for the secondary level. Now, having signed onto the SDG Summit Declaration, they committed to providing full coverage in secondary education by 2030. In other words, the Agenda 2030 accelerated and issued a deadline for the fulfillment of the obligation which countries could have achieved by endorsing their legal instruments. An important characteristic of SDG 4 is that in its approach to rights, it seeks to guarantee human rights as a fundamental element of achieving sustainable development. Given that SDG 4 to a large extent is aligned to the right to education, notwithstanding the fact that in itself it establishes no legal obligations, it articulates clear commitments to 2030, which may require the reform of national legislations, which is in line with the desire of the right to education. The right to education is guaranteed in at least 48 international legally binding instruments and in 23 non-binding. The mere fact that the right to education is guaranteed, in light of the thesis of linkages and the holistic approach applied to the concept of education, there is an indivisible link between education as a whole and higher education as a component. The right to education is considered the epitome of indivisibility and interdependence among all human rights. If it is removed, multiple other rights will be automatically denied. For example, the right to free expression or the free development of one's personality will not advance much without the benefits accrued from the right to education. In some cases, where states don't substantiate the right to access higher education, they are invoked to treat it progressively as a right, subject to the level of development and economic capacity of each country. However, member states must annually demonstrate gradual progress, no matter how small, in their national planning strategies to show improvements favoring the fulfillment of the goals identified in their agreements. In the case of the International Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the goal is access to free higher education for all. The tertiary education sector emerged as the enabler for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Higher education has intrinsic and positional value, which makes it comparable to the right to primary and secondary education. Access to higher education is more than a moral obligation, notwithstanding the great challenges ahead to implement it as a universal right. To say that primary school education is a right and that at subsequent levels merely a good is quite an arbitrary approach. The benefits of higher education are instrumental in according better opportunities to access better paid jobs. Exclusion from these opportunities would be equally unjust, hence the need to include it in the framework of the right to education. Moreover, universal free secondary education has been a popular education policy over the past decade, bringing massive expansion in secondary school access. Such expansion will put more pressure on equally universal access to higher education. The construction of knowledge societies is universalizing the access to higher education. Just look at the case of South Korea, where approximately 90% of their youth is accessing higher education. The full right to education at any level can only be accessible to its holders when obligations arising are captured in the substantive legal system of the countries. Do you remember that at the beginning I asked you to remember Ramsay Clark's concept of right? Well, like every subjective right, it has two elements, an internal element and an external one. The internal element consists of the possibility that the right holder does something in relation to the object of the law. The external element will be the possibility of insisting on a particular behavior of another subject and the possibility of his taking action against the competent bodies to claim his right. If we apply this analogy to the right to education, the internal element will be the right to access higher education, which is not accorded to us by someone but by the laws which guarantee this right within the national legal system. The external element would be the capacity to legally claim that right in case it is violated. If that country has not incorporated the international objective rules which accords the right into its national legislation, there will be no possibility of making a legal claim. In that case, the countries have the moral obligation to guarantee access to higher education, not a legal obligation, in which case it is difficult to appeal and to seek restitution of the right in a court of law. For UNESCO, education, to its full extent, is a basic human right and the best investment we can make to guarantee a sustainable future and leave no one behind. UNESCO's strategy for normative instruments 2021-2026 encourages member states to use legislative measures linked to the right to education in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal number 4. Thank you very much for your attention. We now leave the channel open for your questions or comments.
Welcome back, and thank you for accompanying us. The channel is already open in case you have any question, observation, reflection on the theme. Anyone willing to launch a question? They will be very welcome. Thanks to you, Mr. Mora. Thanks for being with us. Well, it seems that our internet friends are quite shy today. So if there are not questions or comments, we would like just to restate the importance of this day as International Education Day. And well, we'll say thank you once again and hope to see you soon. Bye.